All right. Well, good morning. I'm glad everyone is here today. I'll just wait for the chatter to come down a little bit more. A little bit more. Okay. Thanks again for joining us today. To those in the room, but also online today, coming in virtually. This is a big day for us. This has been a work in progress for almost 2 years, so we're really excited that we're having this event. So my name is Paul Fagan. I'm the Director of Democracy here at the McCain Institute, which is part of Arizona State University. I can't believe I just said that. Wow. I gotta practice more. But we are inspired by the legacy of the late Senator John McCain and his family. The McCain Institute boldly advances democracy, human dignity, and security. We remain committed to serving causes greater than ourselves with our vision of creating a world that is free, safe, and just for all people. Today, we're honored to launch a critical report, Defending American Democracy in the Digital Age. This report was written in partnership with our partner at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and it addresses the pressing issues of safeguarding democracy from the growing threats posed by disinformation, misinformation, malinformation in the digital age. We'll have two panels today. The first one comprised of our experts that were on our task force. We'll discuss those recommendations. The second panel will focus on Arizona and how issues, we'll certainly talk about what's going on in the elections, how this issue around and disinformation have impacted Arizona, but also we want to talk about solution-oriented. This isn't all about talking about the problems affecting all of us, but how, as Americans, we can come together to focus on the solutions to these issues. So the report sheds a light on the increased threat posed by information campaigns targeting our core institutions of American democracy. In the early age of the digital age, we believe technology would be a force for good, promoting freedom, transparency, and the spread of democratic ideals. And for argument's sake, that has happened. In my old days working in the International Republican Institute, Facebook, Twitter, those early days were very instrumental in the Arab Spring and other revolutions around the world. So we can't forget how much information the social media platforms played early on in our own democracy, but fledgling democracies around the world. However, we've witnessed how the same technology has been weaponized to spread disinformation at scale, undermining democracy and eroding trust in media and institutions. Foreign and domestic actors alike have exploited this to sow division and disrupt the democratic process. As Senator McCain once said, it's more important than ever to strengthen our defenses against foreign interference in our elections. Unfortunately, U.S. laws requiring transparency in political campaigns have not kept pace with the rapid advances in technology, allowing our adversaries to take advantage of these loopholes to deceive millions of American voters with impunity. His words resonate today as we seek solutions to protect our democracy from these evolving threats. The very tools that were meant to enhance global communication have in some cases been turned against us, becoming instruments of control and division. In response to this, the McCain Institute and the Cronkite School established this task force on defeating disinformation attacks on U.S. democracy. It has aimed to explore how best to safeguard democratic institutions, preserve First Amendment rights, and ensure the access to credible and open information sources. The recommendations outlined in this report are aimed at addressing these challenges across sectors, federal, state, and private. While not exhaustive, these recommendations are a crucial starting point for actions needed to protect our democratic process. That's why we're excited to have a diverse group of experts here today from academia, civil society, media, and local government who will share their insights on how disinformation is being weaponized to erode public trust and what steps we can take to strengthen the resilience of our own democracy. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to a thought-provoking discussion. But first, I want to introduce our partner in crime, Christy Rotchke from the Cronkite School.
Thanks, Paul. Just to echo what Paul has said and by way of opening remarks, I'm Christy Roschke. I'm the director of the News Collab at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State. Quite a mouthful. And we've been really pleased and honored to partner with the McCain Institute on this endeavor as we've been working out our recommendations, and we're really excited to present the task force findings today. We're really grateful to McCain for convening such a unique and diverse group of experts to participate in this task force process. The Cronkite School continues to address the impacts of disinformation through novel research and in the classroom. Our faculty have conducted a number of different research projects on how disinformation moves through social networks, how it impacts people and groups differently, conspiracy and disinformation in health communication, how ethnic media outlets are addressing disinformation, and how trust is earned and lost in the institutions of journalism and healthcare, among other topics. And you can find all of that research on our website, and some of it's listed in the report. In this attention economy, we know that the future of our democracy relies in large part on our ability to get credible, fair, useful, and sorry, lost my spot, useful and ethical news and information to receptive audiences. So we'll be talking about our recommendations both for local news, how we can bolster credible journalism and train the journalists of our future like we are at the Cronkite School, as well as ways to incorporate media literacy across K-12 and beyond education, which we're doing in the Cronkite School in a number of different ways. I think we all in this room know that disinformation is a systemic issue that undermines our institutions and democratic processes. So multidisciplinary collaborations like this task force are really essential to neutralizing disinformation's impact. We all come from this from different perspectives and different experiences. And so being able to work together to come up with these findings and present them today is really an important part of this process. So thanks again to the McCain Institute for bringing us all together.
Is this on? It sounds like it's on? Okay. Forth between my glasses. So unfortunately, I wasn't supposed to be speaking or moderating this panel. The leader of our task force, Mike Brandt, who is here, is sick and stuffed up and coughing, so we don't want coughing on our distinguished panelists. But thank you. I want to, I didn't say this in my opening remarks. We want to thank the Knight Foundation and Microsoft for underwriting much of this work and providing the support for this endeavor. Both organizations, the Knight Foundation, is a leader in sustaining media journalism in the United States and around the world, so we couldn't do this without them. But also Microsoft has played an incredible role, and also, as one of the big tech companies, but they continue to work with us and many of us on issues of trying to prevent disinformation, misinformation taking hold in the United States and around the world. So thank you to Microsoft and the Knight Foundation. So this is our first panel. Let me just go through the panel. We have to my left, Rachel Dean Wilson. She is a McCain alum. She's also the managing director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. So we're lucky to have Rachel. She's been one of our key members. Then we have Christy, who introduced herself already. And then Jim Ludis, who is the executive director of the Pell Center and also the vice president of strategic initiatives at Salve Regina University. We'll have all of their bios because they all have incredible bios and backgrounds. But please look at those on our website. But as our experts on this task force, each of you have played a different role, different expertise. But I want to open it up about really the government and where you think the government should be regulating social media, tech companies, and how it impacts our democracy. I know it's very big and broad, but let's start us off. Rachel.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I will say I was first of all, I worked for Senator McCain for almost 7 years. I was his press secretary and then his communications director. So anything that I get to do with the McCain Institute is a good day in my book. But I miss him every day, and I for personal reasons, but then also for principled, courageous leadership, and as someone who's not afraid to tackle hard problems. And what we were talking about today is a very hard problem. It's one, I work at the Alliance for Security and Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. We look at foreign information manipulation and interference. I've been there since 2019, so we've kind of seen the evolution of the challenges in the information space and the political challenges at home that make it more difficult, and then the actual changes in the information space that exacerbate some of our political polarization and challenges. So that's been a ton of fun. But I will say that just broad strokes, it's an increasingly fragmented information space. It is more opaque than it has ever been. And there is less public accountability for these tech companies as far as what we even know about what's going on their platform. So those are problems. On the federal government side and maybe what Congress should do, I would say something. So they've done nothing. They kind of missed the boat on regulating social media companies. And that feels like that ship has sailed a little bit. I think there is a potential, there's the potential for some kind of movement around AI because it feels like a more urgent threat. So if you want to repackage some of these things and add some new elements and make it about AI, what seems to move Congress is some kind of crisis and sometimes not even that. And so I think if I sound frustrated, it's because I am. But it's an incredibly frustrating environment at a critical time for our country, for democracy, and like not to sound too dramatic, but humanity. Like we got to figure this tech stuff out. So that is, I'll leave it there because it sounds like I could go on and complain about this for a while. So please, someone save me.
We'll get into more specifics, and I forget to allow you your couple of minutes of opening remarks, but I think
I packed a lot in there. I apologize.
You like as a good political communications director, you didn't fully answer the question. But no, just kidding.
That's right. Notice.
But you took liberty. But Christy, why don't you give us a little bit more about what you do at the Cronkite School, and then talk about these issues. I mean, you do a lot around media literacy. Obviously, government plays a big role, but I'd love to hear obviously more from the Cronkite School and maybe address a little bit about the government.
Sure. So yeah, so I am a media literacy researcher and educator and a proud board member of the National Association for Media Literacy Education. So I tend to always look at this from the side of the end user. I agree with everything that Rachel just said, but two key things I wanted to just elaborate on are the fact that we haven't been able to really resolve any of the issues surrounding social media. I absolutely agree we've missed that train, that bus, whatever, because user habits have changed so much in the last 10 years. I still feel like we're having these conversations as though it were 2015, 2016. We're still bringing the same, I mean, the same platform companies continue to have outsized impact. So yes, they should be talking to Congress and doing all those things, but it's really important to remember that we've moved on in many ways from some of the platforms that presented the biggest problems in 2016 and 2020, and we haven't even figured that out yet. So I'm always looking at what can we do for people, both individually, in communities, groups, groups in the real world, groups online, to help them better understand what they're actually doing when they're engaging with media. So it's really not my expertise to talk about what the platforms can and should do, although I certainly have plenty of thoughts, more how we need to educate people on how they have become the product of these very influential and wealthy companies globally, right? We are basically the product of the internet at this point. Our attention is the product. And we don't teach people at any age what that looks like, how they can help themselves out of that situation, how they can opt out of some of these things. And I don't see why that's so hard. I think we should be thinking about media literacy as a set of skills and competencies that should be introduced to kids even before they're in school, right? Because we're certainly giving them technology before they come to school. Young people are using digital technology before they can read and write. And they're as much of a product as adults are. there are a lot of little ways and big ways we can incorporate media literacy into curriculum, again, starting as early as pre-K. And there are now 19 states, according to Media Literacy Now, that have either proposed or enacted some sort of legislation mandating K-12 media literacy education, but there is still not consensus around what that means. And there's certainly no funding to implement that in most cases. So I think an easy one, it's no brainer, seems like, give some people some money so that they can train people in school and then also in informal education spaces. Again, I also could go on for 100 years about that, but I will stop.
We will come back to you for more specifics. But I think that the issue around funding, especially school-age children, is going to be something that's very important moving forward. And I know, you know, you can talk about media literacy and almost in the same vein as civic education, where those two areas are vastly underfunded, undereducated. But anyway, we can talk more about that later. Finally, Jim, I just, you know, want to give you the floor, some opening remarks around this issue, and then we'll.
So, first of all, it's congratulations to you and the entire team here at McCain. The report is outstanding. It's important. If you haven't read it yet, you should, because there's a lot of richness in a very concise package. I am a total geek about this stuff, and I'm going to get so worked up and so excited about so many of these things. But the piece that I really want to focus on is I sort of feel like there's a levels of analysis approach here, right? Because what I'm really interested in is disinformation as a tool of America's adversaries, and how do we respond at a governmental level, thinking about it not just as a technology challenge, not just as a media literacy challenge, but as a foreign policy challenge. Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. In some parts, there's a domestic piece to this too, but that's not what I'm talking about. The foreign use of information as a weapon is as old as statecraft. It's as old as human behavior and human relations. And if we're talking historically about it, there was a time when we would be talking about broadsheets, and then we were talking about newspapers, and then we were talking about radio. So now that we're talking about technology, with that historical perspective, what I'm asserting to folks is that the specific means with which information, disinformation, malinformation are delivered is less important than the fact that there are adversaries using that tool against American democracy. And so the challenge that we have to try to get our heads around is, how do we raise the cost on America's adversaries for using this tool with relative impunity? Limited targeted sanctions on individuals who lead these campaigns do not work. They do not deter state behavior. And that is largely what the American response has been. So what I argued in the task force, and I think what was largely adopted, is an approach to this which views this as a foreign policy challenge, not just a domestic policy challenge, not just a technology challenge. And once we have that concept in mind, then it opens up a different suite of policy options for us to consider. Policy options that sound more familiar with the context of a Cold War, a new Cold War, where we rely on information. If you look at America's principal adversaries, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence this year is doing a great little series of regular reports about what do they see going on with malign foreign information and influence campaigns in the United States. And they've identified 3 principal players in the 2024 cycle: Russia, China, and Iran. Different techniques, different tactics, but these are the 3 principal players. What is the United States doing to hold those 3 brittle authoritarian regimes' own information space at risk? Now, there's probably something going on in a black campaign that we don't know about. But there was a time in American history, not so long ago, where we had public agencies whose principal responsibility was to use information to target foreign populations. We divested of that capability in the 1990s. It's something that we at least need to have on the table as a conversation, to think about how do we use and sort of re-seize the initiative globally in that information contest. I'll leave it at that.
Jim, I feel like I've heard, especially that last comment, a lot, especially lately, the USIA information agency, where in the 90s it was, you know, done away with, didn't think we needed it anymore. But I think obviously this keeps on coming up in conversations, whether it's here or, you know, domestic conversations, international conversations, but it is something that
And
continues.
if I could just make one more quick point about that. Information is neutral. Disinformation is false, right? Malinformation is generally false. Misinformation is information with an error, right? I'm not saying that the United States needs to be in the business of disinformation. We need to be in the business of information. In the early Cold War, we said we're going to counter the big lie with the big truth, and that same spirit can animate us now. But these are brittle regimes that have really strict control over the information space within their own societies. That tells me that they know that information is where they're vulnerable, and that's something that a concentrated, concerted effort by the U.S. government can make a difference.
You hear a lot of stories from, Russians in the past, Soviet dissidents, when they would recollect listening to Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Liberty, and then their radios. So it was effective, and it wasn't just trying to brainwash. It was trying to just provide news, what's going on the other side of the wall during the Cold War. So I couldn't agree with you more. Rachel, I want to, continue on the foreign malign influence campaign. That's a lot of what you do at Alliance for Securing Democracy. Can you draw any parallels to what's going on in the world right now? We are, I think, in the midst of 64 different elections. This is probably the year where more people have gone to the polls than any other year in modern history. Probably over 1 billion people, since India's included and we're included, and Russia is included, even though, they use elections as a way to legitimize Putin's rule. They still go to elections. So anything that you can draw right now from what you've seen in elections that have already taken place to what's going on here in the United States?
Yeah, I could draw a lot of parallels. I'll focus on the information because that's why we're here. But one piece we've been watching closely in other elections has been AI. And kind of how that impacts the information space. And so we have seen in the EU elections where there was not a huge impact. We've also seen elections like in where we had candidates who were supposedly saying, this was in Slovakia, where we had a candidate who was supposedly saying, oh, I'm going to raise the price of beer if elected, and that was like an audio that was circulating, right? Like you couldn't get more stereotypical than this information operation. So like that, so that's like almost funny. But then there was another one where it was talking about how this candidate rigged the election. And that is far more nefarious and probably a lot more familiar to people here. But they had an AI generated audio that circulated right before the election to as proof. And so that's where you get into kind of dangerous pieces on the AI front. There have been other instances where, an AI generated leader who's actually imprisoned is making a statement. So you have these examples of using this technology, honestly, in a much more, this is agnostic to whether it's good or bad, but inventive way than folks are here in the United States, where we're still looking at like deepfake images. There's been audio. There have been the robocalls from New Hampshire. The other piece that I thought was kind of interesting was Argentina. Campaigns used AI throughout the entire campaign, but everything was labeled. So like from my perspective, I'm like, this is like, okay, the stuff they were making, some of it was crazy, like about organ harvesting, but I was like, but it's labeled. And so, that is not the solution of the problem, but that is a step. And I think when we're tackling these issues, everyone wants the solution, and there isn't one. There are many. And so that's a bit of what we're seeing around the world.
That's a good reference point, labeling. Making sure people know that whether it's AI generated or, I want to say non-factual, just, political campaigns, we see them right now, especially you live in Arizona, Wisconsin, Florida, North Carolina, and all these states that are getting inundated with political ads. It's like, it's a lot of information, and some of it's not 100% accurate. But if you have those labels and labeling, that can certainly be helpful to the voter.
We owe consumers signals, right, from official sources. AI is going to be so integrated into our phones and all those pieces that I think it's kind of absurd to be like, oh, I'll label, I pledge to you now that I'm not gonna like AI fix all of my Instagram photos of my children or anything, but like that's possible. That's the future. So maybe I will. Maybe I'll eat those words one day. But from these official sources, I think the labeling is really key and sorting through what this information means.
Christy, if you would mind on the AI issue and media literacy, we're looking at AI in many different lenses, some of it positive, some of it negative. Let's look at it from a positive way. Do you see AI being helpful in the media literacy, and how can it help in that field?
I think that I see AI, specifically generative AI, because I mean, AI, just to differentiate, right? We've been using artificial intelligence for decades. The current buzz is around generative AI and large language models that can produce content unsupervised that never existed in some other place. So it's a different type of AI that I think your spell check, which is also AI. But I think I view AI like I view any technological advancement, which is there's always going to be good things and bad things that come of it. There will be great time savers. There will be great, people will be so inventive on how they can use AI to build different tools, potentially for media literacy, whether that's to help you differentiate between a source that may be more credible or less credible, or simply to help you ask the right questions when you're interrogating a piece of content so that you kind of know what to see. I think where I'm at right now is that I believe that we have made technology the easy scapegoat. It's very easy to say, oh, now AI is going to ruin everything. Social media has ruined everything. And it has accelerated a lot of problems in our discourse for sure. But we've adapted to technology. I mean, Jim was talking about, broadsheets, newspapers, radio, TV, cable TV. We've been here before, folks. It's the same story. I just always come back to how do we prepare people to use these technologies in ways that are ethical and safe, and even maybe more so important, because very few people are going to use these technologies in like obvious, explicit ways. They will probably be integrated into their lives in ways that will be less obvious to the average user. But we need to teach people what they mean and why they shouldn't just be uniformly scared or in favor of anything, right? And the labeling, I think, is great. I think any signal or nudge that can help slow down users as they're looking at information online to get a sense of what it is helpful. But we don't explain to people what the labels mean. We don't stop to explain why the labels are there. My issue with labeling, especially on AI, is that, to Rachel's point, if I put a filter on my Instagram picture, which I mean, I'm a person of a certain age, so they're all getting filtered at this point. Am I meant to disclose that? Have I acted unethically in this way? It depends on the context, probably, right? And so again, these are ideas that aren't new to the technology that is new today, but we don't teach them in meaningful ways to people of any age, really. And one of the recommendations in the report is to teach more critical thinking. And I think my argument is that there's a lot of critical thinking taught in school in a lot of different places. Where we're not making the connection is applying it to modern media. So students explicate all kinds of content at school in math and science and history and English, foreign language, but we're not teaching them how to, critically apply that thinking to YouTube or TikTok or whatever it might be. And there's a huge missed opportunity there, because I was a high school teacher for a long time, and I can tell you that it's an advanced level of competency to be able to apply lessons across contexts. And so the way someone might be critical of news, they might not be as critical of their favorite TikTok person, right? So that was a really long-winded answer. I don't even remember the question anymore, but thanks.
As you can see, we had great conversations during these task force meetings because everyone brings a different perspective. And I think with the report, you'll see it, like we said, it's not exhaustive, but it also touches upon a lot of different issues, domestic issues, but also international issues. And I want to bring Jim, this is where your expertise continues to lie. And I know we have some teed up questions, but I do want to ask this question because I think a lot of Americans at this point are sort of tired of hearing about Russian interference and Chinese interference and Iranian interference. I mean, the State Department and others, the Treasury Department have issued a report just earlier this month about more interference. We listened to a Microsoft presentation the other day. It's public information. They are doing their best to try to get this information out because China, Russia, and Iran are hitting us like crazy right now. But Americans, to my understanding and to some polling, have indicated they're tired of it and honestly, maybe not believe it. Can you address that and why it continues to be important to maybe educate Americans as to how these foreign adversaries continue to try to undermine our own democracy?
Yeah, so that's a really hard question. I think part of the challenge with this issue is that it has been politicized, right? So John McCain, before he died, made a heroic stand on what Russia was doing in America's 2016 election while he still could. There are voices still on the Hill who are concerned about this, but it's not a solitary concern. And what we know, once upon a time, I was a defense analyst, and I remember in the 1990s, Peter Feaver down at the Triangle Institute in North Carolina had done a study about when does the American public support the use of force. And the American public supports the use of force when the leaders of both parties believe that the use of force is necessary. And so if the bipartisan leadership of Congress says, hey, this is a thing, we got to do something about it, the American public loses that sentiment that says, hey, I'm tired of this. And they become focused because now it's not just, your favorite talking head making a case, your favorite team making a case. It's like, oh, this might actually be important to the country. So if we want to get back to doing something substantive about this from a societal perspective and from a perspective where the American public believes that this is actually an urgent thing that we need to do something about, we need some bipartisan agreement and movement on this where the leaders of both parties in Congress are seized with the issue and committed to doing something about it.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, right. Rachel.
Yeah, if I could get in on this question too, because it's such a good one. Two things. So first, when I think the headlines are Russia interferes, there's the DOJ indictment. People are like, okay, let me put that into my bucket in my head of either, something I want to engage in or totally dismiss on a partisan level. And that really, that misses the point. And I think we need to start digging in a little bit more on like the actual tools and tactics, because what we found at ASD is when we're explaining what tools and tactics are used by foreign actors, you see there are similarities across the information space. So it's not just like Russia's not the only one that does this. You have kind of even marketing organizations that have similar tactics in some respects. So it's really about educating people about when you open your phone, what environment are you stepping into? And it's a hostile environment. Everyone wants to influence you. They want to impact you. They want you to take an action or think a thought. And I don't know that is how we are opening apps on our phone with that kind of like protective. So I know that is a lot to pull all the way from foreign interference, but I think you get there quite quickly if you dig into like how exactly this is happening. The other thing I would say, sorry, Chrissy, did you want to get on there? The other thing I would say about the polarization piece is we are not served well, like by Iran supports Kamala and Russia supports Trump. Part of this conversation. It's, it is a fact that there are preferences, but they're playing both sides of these political debates for a chaos and undermining effect. So like, great if their candidate wins, that's cool too. But if we start to think of these foreign actors as like, right, every foreign actor has a preference and that's part of politics and it's too normalized. And so I do think when that is the emphasis of, that's the headline coming out of these reports, we're in a bad spot.
It would be great that both political parties could just be on the same page that foreign malign influence just is bad. Like you said, it's sowing divisions. They are trying to sow divisions in our society, through polarization. And that should be, that is just a national security threat. Full stop. I want to, Rachel, I just want to ask you another question, especially as some of you work at ASD, around public information. We are here in Washington, and we're, you know, a lot of us are kind of the policy wonks and like to talk amongst a room of ourselves. But at the same time, we are trying to do more in Arizona. You're trying to do more on the road. Can you tell us a little bit more about your road show? Trying to give you a little plug.
We're actually doing one with the
know.
McCain Institute.
Yes, in next month. But it goes to show that we need to get this information out to broader audiences, out of swing, you know, not just swing states, but to broader audiences around America. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing, and, you know, maybe what some impact that you're seeing.
Yeah, so it's really the theory I just kind of put out. If we can come at this issue from a foreign actor perspective, that's going to be more unifying. We can get a little bit bigger audience if we're talking about Russia, China, and Iran, particularly China, but they're kind of the least interesting foreign actor, at least in this presidential election thus far. So if we can come at it from that foreign actor perspective, get people into a room and start talking about tools and tactics used, the overarching goals of foreign actors, then it very quickly evolves into a conversation about our information space, about our own democracy, about how we're engaging in our own democracy, and what some of those solutions are. And so we try to do kind of a public event and then smaller meetings around it. I've done work with election officials, kind of engaging on slices of these topics. But it's been kind of at the core of what ASD does since I started, that we try to get outside the Beltway as much as possible. Yeah. So, and we're going to Pittsburgh. I'll be in Pittsburgh next week. In addition to our public event, we're talking to a high school class. So yeah, I'm excited about that. And some other things. So yeah, we're just gonna be out there talking to folks and hoping that people engage.
I think it's important that we, you know, everyone, you know, continues to engage different communities, to debunk, pre-bunk a lot of the information out there. Christy, I want to get to this issue around local news. Obviously, you're from the Cronkite School, focuses a lot on journalism. You, I believe, been a journalist, and you've taught and all of it. This is a, you know, maybe also a personal issue. We have news deserts around the country. Can you talk a little bit about local news, where we're at, where you think we should be going, how we talk about tax incentives within the report, but what are some other incentives that we can do to rebuild local news? And we'll hear later today from a journalist out in Arizona to talk a little bit more about that, but I'd love to get your feelings on that and this whole disinformation, misinformation space.
Yeah, that's a lot. It's a big thorny problem. So a couple of things to highlight, probably many of which you already know in this room, but you know, journalism, U.S. journalism has been in a state of decline for many decades, really, since the internet. And that has had an outsized impact on how we can deliver news as an industry. And it's most acutely felt at the local level. So thousands of local newspapers have closed in the last decade. Thousands of journalists have been laid off just this year. So there is some statistics in the report that talk about this decline. And so there's some things that work here, right? There's also the trust in the media, and I'll use big old air quotes on that, because I always wonder who are you thinking of when a pollster asks you, do you trust the media? And I think that's part of the problem. The decline in trust is just sort of, you know, continues to drop. So we're at a place where we're in a very low trust environment, and we have a lot of cynicism toward, again, big air quotes, the media. If you start to dig into that, and there's reasons, like there's some very valid reasons for why people have a great disdain for national media. And I want to make that distinction, because I do think, and to Rachel's point about, you know, this or that, so many of the narratives that can get constructed by the media, maybe most of them by national media and often fed by politicians, are very binary in their construct. They're very conflict oriented. And, you know, polls that show that the American public is not as divided on key issues as the headlines would suggest really reinforce that we continue to live in this cycle of this or that headlines, this or that stories, this or that politics, when most of us don't live in a this or that. And that's where local news shines, right? Because local news, when it's good, is seeking to give people useful information to live their daily lives in ways that will actually impact their daily lives. So I think Rachel's frame of not saying, you know, it's this or that, or that they're these hard, it's like, what is the impact on, what are the tools and tactics that are impacting you, individual, you, community, you know, you, city, at a much more local level. That's where local news is. That's why people tend to trust their local news much more than they trust national news. But because of the business model and all of these other reasons, platforms, et cetera, that we don't have time to get into, local news is struggling. And in many places, many even large metropolises don't have their own daily news. So there are some great, Diana's an example of this that you'll hear from later. She's amazing at AZ Luminaria. There are examples of nonprofit, small local news organizations that are growing, but the problem is discovery, because there's so much information out there. How do we find these trustworthy voices? How do we elevate them so that people actually see the content, the useful content that they're providing? And that's where I think tax incentives could come into play, as long as they favor the little guys. We really don't need tax incentives for large newspaper chains and large national or media organizations, because they already have the audience. So yes, I think it's important. And as a trainer of future journalists, I stand behind the training at the big journalism schools in this country. We're training our young people to be ethical, credible, fair reporters, and they care a lot. They care a lot about the future of this country. They care a lot about the work that they do. And they're getting hammered when they go out into the field by people who think if you're a journalist, you are evil. So I think we have to have these conversations locally, and we train our students to get out into the community more, to talk to people in groups that where they can say, hey, I'm just like you. I live in this community. I care about this community, instead of having this like arm's distance length. So we got to support our journalists, because if that information goes away, then the void gets filled with all of the lies.
I'd actually love to jump in on that void, because there's been reporting this year. And so one of the other things that I do around disinformation is with my great colleague and collaborator, Mark Jacobson, we publish a weekly newsletter called the Active Measures Newsletter. Now there's the Active Measures Newsletter podcast if you really want to geek out with us every week. But we've had reporting, and I'm going to totally botch who did this study, but the Russians have been trying to fill that void. It was in a campaign called Doppelganger, which you've seen in the news recently, where they have essentially been creating official sounding news sources in the United States and in Western Europe, and filling it with newsy sort of stuff. And these are platforms for the delivery of divisive content. But they look just enough like a real credible news source, hence the name Doppelganger, that they are filling the void where these traditional news sources, local news sources, are collapsing. And I think that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that actual good local reporting is part of the antidote to bigger, broader national disinformation campaigns. Was it an Alliance study that I'm referencing?
So no, but wait, so we have related work that I really wanted to get in there and further hijack this conversation from Paul. No, but we do have a new tool called the Information Laundromat, and it looks at content similarities and metadata similarities across websites. And so the initial report we did with it looked at RT articles. And what we found is over 400 sites that are republishing RT articles. Sometimes it's, at the bottom of the page, like this is an RT article. But a lot of times there's no, site as to where this came from. And so we have a situation where RT content is skirting platform bans, it's skirting EU sanctions, and it's doing so in a less transparent way so that people don't even know what they're reading. And some of the sites that were most interesting was like an example, this Man Stuff news site. And so it was like Man Stuff. It was like grilling, and I don't know, there were like dad tips on there. Yeah, I mean, it was so stereotypical. And then there's like a tab for the war in Ukraine. And it's really obvious from where I sit what that is. But like, why would that be obvious to someone who just wants to know about grilling? And so just like getting those Russian narratives and perspective into like unsuspecting places and to unsuspecting people.
And if I could just add something that's sort of some of the irony of this is that it's really easy to make a website that looks very professional these days, but sometimes the people who have the hardest time doing that are the news people themselves. And part of the reason is because this content costs nothing if it's made up, right? Especially now with, speaking of AI, if you can just like put some data points in ChatGPT and have them write a 400-word news article, you don't even need a person to come up with the lies. You can just have machines do it. So they can invest in the time to make a news site look professional, where some local news organizations have the worst websites because their time and effort and resources are spent reporting on actual things. Their 2 reporters are at city council meetings, they're at school board meetings, they're working until late wee hours of the night. They're not building websites. And also local news sites, like legitimate local news sites that are for profit, require advertising. And the advertising is terrible on local news sites often. And that it's interesting. I do this with my students all the time. I have them look at websites. They tend to think that these pink slime or aggregate websites are more credible because they typically don't have advertising, because they don't require advertising for their business model. They have that clean sort of newspaper look. Whereas the local, weekly newspaper that also has a website, I mean, it looks like it came out of 1997. And so they misjudge that the actual news site is the one that's not credible, even though we teach them, like, for so long, we were like, look at the aesthetics of the website. Well, this is the absolute wrong advice in 2024. But I just find that it's so frustrating because we can't, like, the business can't help itself with the looks. And then so they continue to get beat by these things that, I want to know about grilling, and with the side of the war on Ukraine, apparently.
No, I think this issue around pink slime and fake news sites, it has infiltrated our society, where it kind of goes back to this issue around media literacy. Where are we getting our information? How is it credible? Those credible sites
or even how is it paid for?
How is it paid?
I mean, most people have no idea how journalism is paid for, and they're very skeptical of for-profit journalism. But kind of to your point about tools and tactics, if you could have the opportunity to explain to people why journalists need to be paid for their work, just like any other business, and how that works, then we can sort of rewrite some of those misconceptions.
Yeah. We're coming to, we have about 10 minutes left on this panel. I want to make sure that all of you kind of get your last bits of information on this. But Jim, I want to come back to you. Today, Senate Foreign Intelligence Committee is hosting the executives of, I believe, Meta, Microsoft, and Google to talk about foreign interference in our elections. How do you see the private sector, these tech companies, big ones, small ones, working with the U.S. government in trying to prevent, or what's their role? And how can the U.S. government and state governments as well work together to, help prevent,
So after 2016, a lot of the big platforms created these trust and content moderation enterprises that were, I think, let's be very candid, we're in Washington, D.C. This was an effort to thwart a regulatory push by Congress. They said, don't regulate us, we'll regulate ourselves. Right? We'll let you fill in your own punchline there. The reality is that in the, what are we now, 7 years since then, we have largely seen those efforts atrophy, in some cases be completely disbanded. And so these platforms have a better sense of what's going on in their networks than anybody else, bar none. So they have a huge role to play. They could, in some cases, reopen their APIs to independent researchers. That would be a huge step forward.
We would really love that.
Right? They could be more transparent about how things are being, particularly some of the paid stuff that's still appearing on their platforms. And I think that from the federal government side, the ability of the federal government, which for a time was in question, to actually communicate with these platforms it's an essential step in this process. So we need to protect that ability. But I will continue to come back to my first point, that it's not just about the technology. It's a bigger, broader challenge that we face that has a societal element, has a platform element to it, but it also has a broad national policy aspect to it too, particularly on the foreign piece.
2 points on research. I can agree with you more. More researchers need access to information on the big tech. And we've seen that is dwindling. There's a reverse in all of that. And I know partners or people part of the Knight network. They're hosting an event, I think, at the end of the week at George Washington University. So not necessarily a competitor, but talking about the issue of researchers being harassed. We're a major research university, and I know this is a big issue for researchers, especially who are focused in the information field. The harassment that they get online, offline. I'm not saying that they're getting it from the big tech by any means, but they face such critical threats against their work, against themselves, against government, and we really need to put an end to that, because researchers are here to research and help us as Americans understand the landscape a lot better. So as part of a public university, a research university, I think we need to stand up to those efforts to thwart research, the anti-research movement. It's not right. I'm sure I'll get blowback for that, but we're part of a university. But did you want to say something?
Here. Here.
We are coming up to an end, so I want to give each of you, just a couple of minutes of final thoughts, things that you want to kind of get out there in cyber world. So we'll start with you first.
Thank you. So anytime we have this conversation, it feels so important to get all these pieces out, but it also feels really heavy, and we haven't done a lot on solutions. I mean, we've talked a little bit about our recommendations, but like a lot of it has been like, yes, and then there's a complicating factor, and there's another complicating factor, and that can feel incredibly overwhelming and demoralizing, and then you don't want to engage with it at all. So let's not do that. But I think the reason these types of conversations are so important is because people need to understand kind of the complexities of the information space and then behave differently. And then interact with their phones and their apps and their platforms differently. Engage in ongoing conversations about, how if it's false election narratives are impacting your community, or if it's, a fear of AI and how that may impact your community, or the opportunities with AI. But like pick a slice and really get engaged. And if it's not a slice on this topic in particularly, just get engaged with your community. I think there are so many, I'm involved in so many efforts, and it's like, oh yeah, we brought this community and that community together, and look, good things are happening. I was at an event yesterday for this Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, and it's election officials and it's law enforcement. And the work that they've done to bring those two communities together and kind of understanding each other is really inspiring and what we need right now. So much of this is sitting down and talking with humans. And I know that may be a cop-out as far as recommendations go, but it can't be lost, and I don't want everyone to be like, well, that was depressing. So with that, I'll toss it over to Christy.
One thing I do want to say, it does start with humans. I mean, democracies start with humans, and elections start with people. No matter how technologically advanced, and we have Stephen Richer, who's here, who can talk about all the technological advances Maricopa County has done over the past 10 years to ensure credible and safe elections. At the end of the day, it's people. They are the foundation of our elections, and we can't forget that. So humans are not a cop-out.
Yeah, fair. And Stephen Richer especially, I don't say this lightly, is like standing up for democracy on the front lines and is really inspiring. So thank you for all you do, Stephen.
We'll hear more from him later. Over to you, Christy.
I will also say humans. That's my answer too. No, but really, what I will say is, again, I think that education in the area of media literacy, and it not just where it crosses over with misinformation, but just helping people, to Rachel's point, better understand what's happening when they're engaging with their phones or their laptops or their streaming service or all the millions of things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, and how it's impacting them implicitly, explicitly, the choices that they're making, how they are the product, what propaganda techniques are being used by, you know, the Instagram ads and the foreign governments alike. We need to be investing in this in real material ways. It's great that California has issued a mandate for K-12 media literacy education. There's no funding behind it. Again, as a former public school teacher, I can tell you that when someone says, now you're going to teach this, you're like, okay, great. Tell me how, tell me where am I going to get the training? We need to invest in teacher training, professional development, curriculum that meets state standards and aligns, you know, I mean, I think a national media literacy curriculum is a good idea as far as like standards to aspire to, that the states can then implement per their departments of education. Similarly, we need to support journalism. I'm sure there are people in this room who feel real grumpy about journalism. That happens every time I give a speech. And when I say that, I mean, we need to support the folks in our community, the ones who are at these very local level school board meetings, you know, election. Like I just saw a great article this morning about from one of our local Arizona news organizations. Our ballot is going to be like double-sided. It's going to be very long. And this, and a lot of people don't get to the second side. This is a real problem in Arizona. There's so many ballot initiatives. So this article, point by point, says this is what it is. Here's plain language on what it means. I haven't read the whole thing, so I'm not sure. I don't think they're giving recommendations. It's just, this is what it is. Get to the end of the ballot, because you want to make sure you're voting on everything. If you don't understand what you can vote for, then we've lost a lot of things. And so that kind of civic education through journalism is happening at the very local level, and we are not supporting it as individuals, as communities, as government. And so we need to correct that, because the more we can come together as humans with all the best information, I think that's where we help solve some of these problems.
Over to you, Jim.
So I'm, I would echo what I said a couple times here, right? This is not just a technology problem. It's certainly a people problem, but it's really a foreign policy problem. And we need to rethink about how we engage with America's adversaries at a national policy level to hold their information space at some risk. But I want to end with the last thought about people as well. And I'm gonna step a little bit in Christy's space here. But when I give these talks, it's very easy to get very depressed very quickly talking about this topic. And people will say inevitably, so what can I do personally? And I teach a little. And when I talk to my undergraduate students about how do you assess the validity of a source, I challenge them to think about three questions, right? Is it credible, right? Does it just pass the sniff test, right? And if it doesn't, then maybe be a little bit more skeptical of that source. Is the person making the claim someone who would actually have been in the room where it happened, right? To quote Hamilton. And if it's not plausible, well, maybe be a little bit skeptical. And then finally, is there anybody else anywhere on planet Earth reporting what this person is reporting? And if the answer is no, be a little skeptical. And what we can all do with that is, because we're not just all consumers of information now. In this day and age of social media, we are purveyors of information. So use those critical thinking tests before we share things ourselves on social media. And that's something that anybody, anywhere can do any day.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank Jim, Christy, and Rachel, not only for joining us today, but taking part in our task force for the past year and a half, almost 2 years. We couldn't have done it without you. It is a collaborative effort. It's particularly thanks to Christy and the Cronkite School for the partnership. It's great to work with our university partners. We get a lot more out of it than just doing it by ourselves. And Arizona State University is a massive place, so it's a great way to integrate. But thank you to our panelists. We hope that you take a look at the report. It is solution oriented. We're not trying to talk about doom and gloom. I think we talked about a lot of things that Americans can do to protect themselves, but also enhance our democracy. But thank you. Stay tuned. We're going to take a short break here. We're just going to have a little bite to eat here, but then we'll have a panel just focused on Arizona after this. So thank you. Right. We're excited to have everyone back, but also talk about when our first panel focused on our task force report, the issue around how disinformation, misinformation, malinformation is impacting, American democracy, nationally. But we wanted to bring the conversation a little bit more locally. Since we are, the John McCain, Institute, essentially, the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. We feel like we owe it to Arizonans in Arizona to learn what is going on right now in Arizona. I think as anyone, if you live under a rock, you know that Arizona, and along with a few other states, is ground zero for I would say, our democracy, not just elections. What goes on in Arizona, it has implications for the future of our country. So we're really excited to have a great panel here today to talk about different issues. We're talking about community building, journalism, elections, and how each of these individuals is seeing what's going on in Arizona. And again, looking at the solution oriented. Obviously, we all have problems, but there are just issues that need solving. So I'm really excited that we have three great panelists, and let me introduce them. I am gonna give a little bit more bios this time. To my left, I always get my left and right wrong. We have Jane Anderson, and she is wearing her hat for the conservative agenda for Arizona. Just a little bit about Jane. She's a native Washingtonian. Grew up outside the city in McLean, which I live there too. I'm just going to read her bio. She piqued her interest in political process and community engagement. She received her BA in economics from Brigham Young's University and an MA on constitutional law and political theory at the City University of New York. Varied experiences working in New York, on Wall Street at J.P. Morgan, public affairs with the Church of the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in New York City. And as a college professor teaching political science, Jane currently serves on a statewide coalition aiming to prevent political violence as a team lead for the Valley Leadership Civic Engagement Impact Team, and on the boards of Right Count for Our City Chandler and Ryan House. She's the executive director of the Conservative Agenda for Arizona. Jane and her husband of 26 years have 4 children. They have identical twins facing challenges of autism, blindness, epilepsy, and cerebral palsy, and caring for them has allowed Jane a better understanding of marginalized populations and the importance of seeing things from different perspectives. So Jane, thank you for being here. This is why it's like fun doing like an Arizona panel. It's like, it's home, not to say anything against the others. And then we have Diana Nanez from Arizona Luminaria. She is the editor and co-founder of the Arizona Luminaria. Let me get your bio out here. She's an investigative journalist and a narrative writer, editor, and storytelling coach whose story of Indigenous and Borderlands community was part of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize winning Arizona Republic team coverage. She served as a board member for the, I don't know the acronym, but National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and is a member of the 2017 cohort of ASNEs. I know. But she's also a graduate of the Cronkite School, I believe. So just welcome home to ASU once again. We invited Diana back. She did an event for us earlier this year, so we just thought the world of her and really wanted to get her knowledge of local journalism and how it's impacting her community back there in Arizona. And then finally, we have Stephen Richer. He's the county recorder of Maricopa County. I think of all the people on the panel, he's probably globally known due to the Maricopa County being sort of the center of the universe when it comes to elections just around the world, it seems. But Stephen is the 30th recorder of Maricopa County. He was elected in November 2020 and took office in January 2021. Prior to his election as recorder, Stephen worked as a lawyer and business person. He holds a bachelor's degree from Tulane University and a master's degree from the University of Chicago and a JD from the University of Chicago Law School. Together, Stephen and his wife live in South Phoenix. So Stephen, thank you for coming today and being on this panel. Everyone's very busy here. You know, what's going on in you know, with elections going on, each of you are playing an important role in what's going on. But I wanted to give you just a couple of minutes to tell us what you're doing, what you're seeing, why you're doing it, and then we'll open it up to more questions. So we'll start with you, Jane.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I think of anyone on this panel, I represent the everyday Arizonan. So why am I involved? Number one, it's because I have children and I am deeply concerned about the future of our state. I have a phone that I'm going to reference because I want to focus on civic engagement. And there are so many good things happening in Arizona from a civic engagement standpoint. So I'm going to just outline just a few of them. I think civic society and these local organizations are one of the best ways to address dis and malinformation. Our last panel ended with the word human connection, and that is the essence of civic engagement. So just to give you a little bit of the landscape in Arizona, we have groups like the Arizona Democracy Resilience Network, headed up by a Republican and a Democrat who are working cross-party to try to figure out issues. We have a chapter of Leadership Now, if you're familiar with them in Arizona, specifically trying to engage business leaders to speak out about democracy issues. Valley Leadership is a local organization where we are addressing not only formal civic engagement, but also participating in democracy in a kind of a small d way, which is creating dialogue across lines of difference. Two groups I really want to spend a little bit of time on is one, Mormon Women for Ethical Government. I am their Arizona Protecting Democracy Specialist. This is a group of over 8,000 women across the nation who are tasked with being peacemakers and trying to hold our society accountable for having an ethical government. We do things like media literacy campaigns, op-ed labs to help women engage in effective ways in their community, as well as presenting opportunities to have difficult conversations. Most recently, the next hat I've taken on is as executive director of the Conservative Agenda for Arizona. We realized that just because I think that our wonderful election officials put out results that were free and fair and I supported doesn't automatically make me left of center. So we had groups like Our Street and McCain Institute come into Arizona and convene conservative leaders and say, you know what? We need to have conservative voices that are speaking out and supporting our election officials. So that is why we founded Conservative Agenda for Arizona. We are, if you come out in a couple of weeks, there's going to be some billboards on the 202 out in the Phoenix area that has our label and says, thank you to our election workers. We want to connect being a conservative with upholding our elections and gratitude for the good work that they do. Just a couple points I'll finish with is one thing that we have to be really good at, or better at, I should say, is right now as a conservative and trying to combat mis and disinformation. For a long time, I sat in my tower of like-minded people and pointed my fingers at the people I think perhaps were approaching things from the wrong way. We can't do that if we actually want to move the needle. And so we need to start calling people in instead of just calling people out. Civic engagement is how that is going to happen. We need to use the tools of honesty, empathy, and listening. We are all subject to the plague of mis and disinformation. And so only when we recognize with humility that we ourselves are part of this ecosystem and call people in to understand perhaps why they're engaging or why a certain piece of information is resonating with them, that's, I feel like, when we can make an impact. So excited to represent those civic tools in our society.
Jane, thanks for those opening statements. And I think you can understand why we wanted different voices on this panel to understand better about civic engagement. I think you're going to bring a lot to this conversation. Over to you, Diana.
Everyone, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you, both virtually and in person. I am a local community journalist for almost 20 years in Arizona. I love that you kind of said, like, here's what I'm representing. Because I think in journalism, that is our main goal, is to ensure that everyone feels seen and represented and heard.
You want to?
Is that better? Is that happening? Is that happening? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right.
To start from the top.
I know. Oh my gosh. What did I say? No, representation. I love that you started with that because I do believe at the core of journalism, our job, our responsibility, and the privilege of sharing people's stories is ensuring that everybody is seen, heard, feels like their stories are accurate. And so when we talk about democracy, it can sound like a very big D. I would call it like a highfalutin word. And being that I come from a family of farm workers and Mexican immigrants, they would say those same things, but in Spanish. And I worry at times when we have these conversations, we've been having these conversations, that word doesn't represent the everyday person in our nation and in our Arizona and in our communities, because at its core, democracy is about survival, especially for people who are underrepresented, misrepresented, and marginalized. And that means everybody. That means people with disabilities. My nephew lives with autism. My son was born with some pretty severe disabilities, and luckily some really great intervention in our schools helped with that. And so I think in these conversations over democracy, I think probably everyone here and everyone listening has been to multiple forums over the past few years with the big highfalutin democracy word. And I challenge us as neighbors, especially in our desert lands, especially in our borderlands, where for several years now, there has been an effort to divide us. I challenge us today to find ways to be more united and sharing your stories, because when you can connect at that level through local journalism, which is what we did. I worked in corporate journalism for 15 years and then left corporate journalism to launch a nonprofit newsroom. I wanted a more ethical, equitable, caring, thoughtful way to show people that at our roots, we have more in common. And almost every poll that you'll see, in Arizona included, shows we have more in common. We agree more than we disagree. And that is often the malinformation, the misinformation, and the disinformation that divides us.
Thank you, Diana. Stephen, we'll give you a few minutes. Talk about
Test.
your topic.
Is this, we like that? All right, great. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm one of the few elected Republicans who still proudly brands myself in Arizona as a Kyle Flake Ducey McCain Republican. And there was always this myth that there was this McCain mafia that was out there that was secretly pulling the strings of operations in Arizona. And I just want to say, if you're out there, please induct me. That hasn't happened yet. If there's a tattoo, I'm in for it. I don't have any tattoos, but you know, I always imagined a dragon would be my first one. But if it's just like this little logo, then we could do worse. So let's see what's going on. I run an office of 150 full-time employees, and we are statutorily tasked with a few things. But I think the things most germane today are voter registration, and I run early voting for Maricopa County. As suggested at the outset, of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the worlds, that conversation chose Maricopa County to play out in a grand way. And I think it's fitting that we're at the McCain Institute, because what's happening in Maricopa County, believe it or not, has journalists from around the world who are coming in to report about American democracy. And I think that's why this is it's more than just the nuts and bolts of election administration. It's more than just stamping out whether or not Sharpies affected the 2020 election. It is, I was just sitting at a table with a bunch of people who apparently read Russia Today on a very regular basis, or at least follow them on a very regular basis professionally. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. And I think that they are all coming to the United States, to Maricopa County, to ask, is American democracy okay? Because that's a proxy for, is world democracy okay? Because if American democracy is not okay, then I think some countries that are more precariously placed will gravitate towards the Russia model, towards the China model. And it's why we know that some of these foreign state adversaries are trying to help out some of our domestic friends in sowing the seeds of discontent with our democracy. And so it's a privilege, really living history, being on the front row seat to this chapter in American history in Arizona. But it's also a challenge because every single day we have to wake up and we have to make the operation happen, but then we have to answer questions. We have to do education, and we have to fight through a lot of stuff that wasn't extant in election administration 10 years ago. Things like cybersecurity, things like being able to give a press conference, things like dealing with lawsuits. I deal with more lawsuits now than when I was a lawyer. And so just it's a lot. It's interesting, but it's been a privilege. And I will say on a heartening note, the call to arms has been answered by lots and lots of really qualified people, and there's lots and lots of really qualified organizations that are getting in this space. I'm sorry, your name was, we were sitting, sorry. Max was telling me that some of the work that he does with States United for Democracy and some of the sophisticated briefings that they put together for election administrators and just something like that wouldn't have existed. And now the space is bringing in some of the top minds. And so like a lot of people are working on this, and I think that's why we're going to get through 2024, but not without challenges.
Thank you, Stephen. I just want to say, I think a lot of us have said it, but thank you, Stephen, for your service. I think election workers, as much as any public servant, are frontline workers. I mean, you're literally on the front lines of democracy right now, and we know the threats that you face. We know the threats that your colleagues have and I think in your colleague Bill Gates always reminds us that it's not just him, it's not just you. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of Maricopa County officials and Arizona officials who are working to ensure the credibility, the fairness of elections. So thank you for everything that you do. And it kind of goes to Jane's point. I mean, election workers we need to support our election workers. I mean, all of us who are a little bit older have been to our same election polls year after year with the same people, their teachers, their community, their aunts, uncles, grandmothers, and whatnot. They're not threats. And they're just doing their job. And I think you've been doing your job. Others have been just doing their job to ensure that elections happen. And they start with people again. But so I just wanted to make sure that we thank you for your service to this country, which, I mean, I know it's to Maricopa County, but as you stated, it has ripple effects. But Jane, I wanted to pull on a thread that you talked about, particularly about civic engagement. You've done a lot in your community, religious community, civic community. How do you go from pointing fingers to drawing them in? We've heard a lot about it in different types of engagements where there's more of this. Let's stop pointing fingers and try to figure out how to talk to one another without so much vitriol.
I think one thing that it starts with is, per the last panel, we have bad actors, and the sole purpose of this dis and malinformation is division. So we have a choice to make when we encounter people in our life. It could be family members, it could be neighbors that come at us with information that we don't feel like is credible or accurate. We have a choice to make. The choice can be to end the relationship and decide that this person is not someone that's informed in a way that I want to engage any longer with them. Or we can offer an alternative perspective and then embrace the whole person. Embrace a multitude of identities that person holds instead of simply their position that we might think is incorrect on one thing. I think another thing that's important is that we draw on shared identities. One thing that I'm doing with a church hat that I wear for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I approached the mayor of Chandler, which is the city that I live nearby, and we said, you know what? There is the potential for political violence in Arizona. There's been lots of threats made against our elected officials. What if the Saturday before the election, you get up and you recognize that there's going to be an election a few days later, we invite everyone who's running for office to get up as well. And then we say, but no matter who you vote for, we love and serve our neighbor. And then we're going to fill the park with local nonprofits and invite people to wear their favorite nonprofit shirt and come serve together. That's the type of thing where we invite people into community in a way that you don't want to get rid of your political identity, but it's no longer the most important thing in your life. And again, we embrace that whole person. We decide that we are not going to let the purpose of that dis, and malinformation, which is division, we're not going to give in to that. We're going to fight against that. And that's really where community comes in. Have
you seen an impact over the past couple of years, the changing of tactics from, election to election?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's interesting is no longer do we have the trusted messenger model that works in communities, right? It used to be like, this person has the trusted message, and you kind of figure out, well, if there's no longer a trusted messenger up high, how do I become a trusted messenger? And so moving hearts and changing minds really happens in those really small interpersonal relationships. And I see people making more of an effort trying to move the needle on that. So I think it's making a difference. It's hard. It's hard work. It's hard to be in spaces where there might be conflict, but it's worth fighting this plague and this battle to make it happen.
Stephen, did you want to jump in?
I was going to say, how do you discipline yourself? Because that is harder. And I would imagine sometimes you just want to give this primal scream and just be like, no, that is inaccurate. But telling somebody that they're an idiot is never the way to change somebody's mind. And so how do you discipline yourself? How do you remind yourself of just sort of the long game, especially in a world filled with social media where it seems like the purpose of it is just to like win arguments, to dunk on people?
Yeah, so I'll give an example. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I went on social media, and there was another gentleman from my congregation who was posting some information I didn't think was accurate and supporting a candidate I didn't like. So he would make a comment, and I'd see half the congregation like, and then I would make a comment, half the congregation would like it. So I finally turned to my husband, and I said, get in the car, load up the dog, we're going over to this guy's house. But I had a thing of banana bread, and I printed out a poster, a picture of Biden, and underneath a little thing that said, "Make America Bake Again." And I went to his door and I knocked on it, and he kind of opened up like, how am I going to react to this? And I just said, you and I have so much more in common than one would believe by reading our social media posts. So let's agree that there's some things we don't agree on, but I love you. I appreciate you. We serve together. And so I think that's how you do it. I think you need to listen. What is motivating people to want to believe in this? And until they feel heard, they're not going to be open to shift how they change their perspective.
We scale that? How much banana bread can you bake?
No, I can never say no to banana bread, especially if it has chocolate chips. Diane, I want to turn to you. You're in the midst of Arizona. You've started your own newspaper along with others. How are you and your colleagues dealing with the election and how you're communicating your stories? Because I know you have maybe a different approach to journalism than traditional corporate journalism, as you said. So I'd love to hear from you on how you're working in this space right now.
Oh yeah, I would totally forget. So thank you, neighbor. I think the perspective of journalism is if you can stay at your roots, that you're a community journalist and that you live in that community and your kids go to school in that community, then I think you're truly serving people who need information, accurate information, people who want to know that the local officials who represent them are being held accountable for something as basic as streets to something as serious as elections and my vote. The romantic idea of my vote should count. Why did I have to wait in line for 16 hours? I remember one year my mom and dad, when my father had injuries from diabetes, stood in line for about 12 hours to vote. And so that is something that you don't want for anyone, right? You don't want that for your mom. You don't want that for your sister. You don't want that for your brother. You don't want that for anyone to think that that's the way our systems work. And so I think when we talk about approaches to journalism, when I worked at the Arizona Republic, a lot of the stories that I would work on would also go into USA Today. Stories about a lack of representation from Latino communities, stories about indigenous communities, they would often, and we'd have these conversations and be like, well, how do we make it a national story? And that voice, just like that. Nanyas, how do you make it a national? I was like, oh my gosh, we're gonna do this again. First of all, local journalism is national journalism with more heart. And it's the people at the center that are that heart. And also, please don't tell me that, because as soon as the New York Times or Washington Post, which I love them, come in and do the story, that makes it a national story? I don't think so. So the reality to your question is this, is dealing with elections. And last week we had the Trump rally on the same day that Emhoff came and had an appearance in the Tucson area. And so our small and mighty newsroom was doing this literally at like, okay, so how are we going to cover this so it connects? And how are we going to cover it so that whatever officials say, they're being held accountable as we work on a tight deadline and in real time? We ran a daily blog. We tried to make sure that we enrich that with voices so people can hear what your neighbors are thinking, what people are thinking across the board. There was 2,000 plus people at the Trump rally. Tucson is known as a progressive bastion in Arizona, one of a few there in our state. But it's surrounded by a lot of like conservative communities. It was so overflowing that there was not enough room to be in there. So like in this 100-degree day, people were standing outside just trying to get in. And I think if we aren't honest about the realities of it, there are many thousands of people across this nation that have very different political views and will use their voice and vote. And why are they voting that way? Like, that's it. Like, why? You know, your kid when they're annoying you, but why? But why? The approach is, but why? Because we need to hear your voice. And I'll speak of one voice. Our reporter spoke to somebody who was wearing a Latino for Trump. And in Arizona, we really are like this national thing, because then there's the Republicans for Harris, right? Like, it's just, we are in the mix. There's a reason why the campaigns consistently come, even if it's not Pennsylvania. There's a reason why after the debate, they were both there immediately. There's this core root of what's happening in our nation that is in the mix of the very desert melting pot of Arizona. And this Latino man said that he had always voted Democrat, but he was struggling with his trucking business, eventually lost it, and felt that he needed a new way. And this was his new way. And unless we approach journalism, both locally and nationally, with the why, with the why, with the why, and the voices and the voices and the voices, we will not hear the base core of thread, whether we agree or disagree with someone for what they believe and why they believe it.
Thank you, Diana. I think, you know, we should be reading more Arizona Luminaria. Not to say that we shouldn't be reading the Republic or other outlets, but I think as you said, reporting journalism with a heart, telling those stories and getting to the why is really important. I think we've heard from both you and Jane as to how we're getting, or the why and what we're doing about it. Stephen, as we keep on saying, you know, Maricopa County is in the center of all of this. 10 years ago, Maricopa County is, and many counties and election officials probably didn't have much of a communications plan, didn't have much of anything that they think they needed to do to really communicate more broadly to their constituents. How has that changed? And what are you doing? And how have you you know, we're talking about disinformation, and you in particular and others in the county have had to deal with this. How have you gone from like almost doing, I don't say nothing, but it's very different.
Pretty close to nothing. No. I think this is the right question, because I actually think that, you know, people will say, oh, you're fighting for democracy, but the democracy and election administration are just a proxy war for this broader war on truth. And so really what we're fighting is an epistemological crisis. How do you make people believe? How do you get them to listen to you? How do you get them to change their mind about something that has become something of a tribal marker in terms of whether or not you think the 2020 election was stolen? So we say, set that aside. Moving forward, how can we make you believe in the election process? How can we make you have confidence? And so we're playing catch up because as an industry, exactly as was stated in the question, we didn't have these muscles prior to really 2016. And what we're trying to do in Maricopa County is just as much as possible and hope that something stays on the wall. But we're doing tours of our facility. We're doing live streams of our facility. We're doing teletown halls. We're writing articles. We're doing videos. We have deep relationships with the local and with the national media. And so really just trying to get information out there. But I think we're still losing just in terms of raw volume because most election jurisdictions, there are over 8,000 election jurisdictions in the United States, and many of them are quite small. And so Maricopa County is the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States behind only Los Angeles County. And we are quite unique in having now a very significant communications team. But when we're doing that, and when a few other counties are doing that, the flow of inaccurate information is still massively outpowering the flow of information from election officials. So if you're just a random guy getting on the internet, the likelihood that you'll stumble across something that is inaccurate is actually pretty good. And so I want to balance that out. And as we were just saying, when I was learning about a lobster story about how lobsters spread COVID, that's not true. But just like the ability to generate that is pretty easy. The ability to like go find a lobster, pull him out, I guess, like give him one of those nose sticks up there and then just be like, nope, he tested negative, must not have been there. Like that takes work. And so not only are we facing just more people who are doing this, but our time is actually, you know, we have to spend 5 hours for every 1 hour that they spend. And so, you know, we're investing more and more and more, but we're still not matching them. And I think that we will, as a result, have a lot of confused people during the 2024 election. And so we're just trying to get to as many of them in advance as possible.
Do you think you're reaching enough of those voters on a regular basis? I know obviously there was news yesterday about, you know, the voter registration issues. How are these voters going to know?
Are we reaching enough of them? No, but we're trying darn hard. Maricopa County has 4.6 million people in the valley, and so that's a lot of people. So when we're talking about tours, you know, we have a few more people on our tours than Jane has in her bread baking delivery route, but it's still not 4.6 million. And so, and then the other thing is the sort of the fracturing of the media ecosystem, such that you can't just stick something in the Arizona Republic or go on local Fox, local NBC, local ABC and assume that everyone's going to know. And one of the challenges that I've grappled with, and I don't know that I have the right answer, and I've often questioned our strategies. We don't go into some of the places where we know that our detractors are. We never went on Truth. We never went on Telegram. We never went on One America News Network or Newsmax or anything. And I don't know if that was the right decision. But we're trying to get as much information out there as possible because I really firmly believe that there still are people for whom it is merely an informational deficit. Sure, there are going to be some people who, no matter what you say, it's just like, no, I'm not here for the sell. I'm not here no matter how good your facts and your logic. But there are people who are just like, you know, I saw this on the internet and that seemed funny. But if you offer me a good explanation why that's a thing, then okay, I'll listen.
Yeah.
Just to tout Stephen, you know, a lot of this information, this misinformation about elections is just spread person to person. And I was speaking with someone who said, you know, I have a friend. And I was like, this is a friend of a friend of a friend or a friend. This was a friend who said, I went to vote and it said I already voted. And then they told me I voted for the other candidate. And I thought, well, there's a few problems with that story. But I I said, let me get her name and number and sent her to Stephen. So, you know, it kind of goes back to that starfish thing. You know, it makes a difference to this one starfish, but truly, without that trusted messenger model, it is going to be heavy lifting on good actors in our community. And to be clear, we have a lot of good actors, as was mentioned. Yeah, we have a small, very vocal minority in Arizona trying to perpetuate the idea of division, but the vast majority is in the middle. They're exhausted, but I think we're ready to do some heavy lifting to move the needle on that. And Stephen's office is ready to do that, even if it's one by one.
You know, building off of that and some of your comments earlier about civic engagement, do you see your efforts, especially in Arizona, you've had to change your dynamic, you've had to change your approach. Is that something that others are replicating? Do you see in other places? What are you doing different that others can learn from?
I think, again, the idea that we can sit in a room full of people who share our same policies and change the world isn't really how it's going to operate. And I mean, one thing that I think at least is super unique in my life, so as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we are assigned to our congregations by geography. So instead of choosing, hey, I like this pastor, or I like these people that attend at this time, guess what? You attend who you live around. And that hasn't always meant that I align politically with the people that I attend church with, but there's something beautiful about engaging in a community where we may have one thing in common and lots of other things that are not in common. And I think that model of find the common ground, engage where you have that commonality, and then be open and honest and ready to listen across lines of difference is something that is working for us to move the needle, and I feel like can be replicated other places. It's not easy work. It's hard for someone, you know, with a son that's medically fragile during COVID to have people flout recommendations while my life got harder. Those were not easy conversations, but they're important conversations. And everyday citizens can have those important conversations. So that to me is very empowering.
Speaking of audiences, I want to turn to Diana. And as you said, you know, Arizona is the desert melting pot. I love that. Literally, you're literally, yeah, it says we've all ran, you know, over 100 days of 100-degree plus. How do you reach diverse audiences? You have language barriers, I don't want to say barriers, but you have different languages, different cultures. You have Native American populations, and this is one of your tasks with Arizona Luminaria. How are you reaching them, and how is it different? But tell us a little bit more about your approach, especially in
absolutely
this melting pot.
So one thing we do that I don't know any other news org does is we publish in Spanish and English on the same page. Typically, if you go to most news sites, it's English and it'll either have a read in Spanish or it'll go to the Spanish site. And so then you click and you go to the Spanish site. And we just made a decision that if you can't go, my mom would always go, hey, say nobody knows Spanish when they're at the grocery store because they'd say things in Spanish and they'd be like, stop talking, stop saying things and that's literally like, you can't walk more than 5 minutes in Arizona and not hear Spanish language. So like we literally live and breathe that way. People speak Spanglish and like everybody just knows, like I'll be talking to them like, yeah, my mijo, well, I want to hear some chisme, which is gossip, and just like everybody knows what we're saying. So like, why not have our news live and breathe like that? It's an outreach to communities. Disinformation, malinformation has been rampant among Spanish-speaking communities because as you get into this core, I have family members in Northern California who are evangelists, and there's a lot of disinformation as well. The more you are siloed, right? The more you don't have access. And these are access issues. So we're trying to think of solutions, right? Like we know the problems, we live with the problems, we see the problems. How can we think of the solutions? And for us, that was a solution. I was like, let's just do this. We also chose not to have paywalls. that is core for our co-founders. Between the three of us, we have like 60 years combined of local newsroom experience in Arizona. And we decided that everybody must be able to access this information that is about their communities, to educate them, and it must be free. So we work very hard to keep it that way. And I think I want to come back to something that we were talking about in this idea of having people's voices seen and heard and speaking. Maybe we're not going to go on, certain news orgs and speak through an outlet that is completely has false information. Like you said, I don't know if we made the right decision. So our flip on that is that, but I'm going to speak to a bunch of people. So if I'm an elected official, and maybe I'm not going to go onto that that doesn't mean I can't hold a forum that invites people who believe that way, so that I cannot tell you, if you want to make a difference in whatever you're working in, invite the very people who you're trying to reach to engage and be on a panel where they sit right here next to us and talk about why they believe the way they believe and talk about why they don't feel heard. It is so important to our core, because this type of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, it will lead to political violence. It will lead to violence. It will lead to hate. We have seen it. We've seen it happen in elections. We have seen it happen in El Paso. We have seen it happen with so many different communities that eventually it hits the right person who, for whatever reason, believes that they are so marginalized that the only way for them to make a difference is to attack violently other Americans. And that's really, I think, why we're here. When you talk about my approach, I think of that all of the time, that what could someone who feels so disengaged do to harm another person? And how can I reach out to that person before they feel they need to do that?
I think, each of you in your own ways are trying to mitigate that violence, those issues, really trying to get ahead of the curve. And unfortunately, not every single tactic is working, but I think, with combined efforts, through community building, through local journalism, through education, voter education, each of these elements is really going to help, hopefully bring down the temperature in Arizona, figuratively and actually, maybe.
No. Actually, like that's beyond the.
Okay, so maybe that's
topic.
maybe there's a little misinformation. Yes, I can't talk about.
Although whether or not we're experiencing more days over 100 is actually sort of like a consistent source of like doubt, and it's like, we should be able to measure this. This is like, did Ketel Marte have 2 hits last night, sort of thing? Like, was it over or under 100 degrees, sort of thing? So that's disappointing to me.
Stephen, I wanted to, you again, Maricopa County, you've had to devise a lot of new tactics over the past couple of years on how you communicate, how do you combat disinformation, but how you communicate. What have you learned, and what can you pass on to other counties, local officials around the country on how to do a better job of getting information out there, probably before it's too late, so to speak? I think we saw that yesterday. You're really trying to get out there with information to people. What have you learned, and how can you, educate others in this field to do what you had to do?
Yeah. So give a plug for having hard conversations, as you both mentioned. I think that's where a needle is actually moved. But then just turning on the faucet. And so yesterday we the Secretary of State and I had to talk about something that if we just did it and didn't say anything, it would look confusing. And I think that in that vacuum of information, it could have gotten pretty ugly. It was an issue that had the potential to be ugly. It was an issue that was affecting the statewide voter registration database, and it had been affecting it for 20 years. And it was an issue pertaining to documented proof of citizenship in Arizona, which is a really big issue within the elections community, and especially Arizona being a border state right now. We got some of what we expected, but actually the coordination that we did with local media, the coordination that we did with the governor's office, with the secretary's office, with the attorney general, with the 15 counties, we think, fingers crossed, it's only day 2, that it was about as rationally received as we could have possibly hoped. And so, and this was one where we actually had some exposure. Sometimes it's just a completely made up issue. And so maybe that's a sign that either we're getting better at it or that Arizona is getting better at processing it. But a few faults that election administrators routinely commit are, one, I made this really cool YouTube video. But nobody's seen it. Nobody's seen it. Seriously, you posted it to like the La Paz County YouTube page? Come on now. So figuring out existing media distribution streams and plugging into those rather than just putting it out on your own thing. Leveraging the partnerships with local journalists, national journalists to get that out is another good way. Saying I don't have time, and a lot of them don't have time. And the problem with that, though, ultimately is it's penny wise, pound foolish, in that, maybe if we had communicated about the 2020 election better, we wouldn't have spent all of 2021 talking about the 2020 election in Arizona. And so I would say invest in it. We don't yet have a great idea of what the returns will be on that investment long term, but we know that if you don't invest in it, and the status quo wasn't a great situation, because really in Arizona, in the political scene, we have been stuck in a stasis of this same conversation about election administration for 4 years running now. And not only is that a bummer for election administrators, but it's a bummer for anyone who cares about any topic that's not election administration. At our state capitol, the #1 topic in terms of number of bills proposed by state legislators for the last 3 years was election administration. I'm going to go out on a limb, though I don't know all of the different topics, and should suggest that there might be some topics that might affect the guy who's lost his trucking business a little more than whether or not, I don't even know some of these theories, like whether or not what type of pens we can use in terms of election administration. So yeah, those are some lessons that I learned. I keep going back to the Jane thing. This is something I struggle with every single day. Why are you talking? Why are you talking? And maybe some of you are asking yourselves that about me right now, but not so much but are you talking to win an argument? Are you talking to rally the people who are already on your side? Or are you talking to convince someone? And all 3 of those are acceptable goals, but just know that the strategies are very different for those 3 different things. And that if you're talking to win an argument, there might be some benefit of that, but you're not probably convincing that person that you're beating.
I can add one thing. I know Stephen's office has also been really receptive. When we gathered a group of conservative leaders, we said, a major issue is people want decisions on election night. Well, when you have a state that by vast majority votes by mail and can drop those in on the day of, we're not going to get those election results.
Why?
The truth be told, I think this is really incredibly. Do we talk to shame people? No,
I'm okay with it.
So this is really, really important. There has been a drive to reach voters who don't traditionally vote. So Arizona, if you don't know the history, we were one of the states that had legally disenfranchised voters. And so we were required to submit election changes for many, many years under the Voting Rights Act. Any changes to ensure that those changes in laws would not disenfranchise any particular set of voters in an illegal way. So when that changed and the Supreme Court ruled that there had been enough progress made that election officials no longer had to put those forward and have them pass through and ensure, you saw a lot of different groups, church groups, Native rights voting groups, Latino votes groups, like many groups who were trying to reach we did a story a couple of years ago for Democracy Day, and it was mostly around the people who don't vote. Like elections truly are decided by the people who don't vote. They're the great majority. And an effort in communities to reach people, they wanted to get them signed up on the early ballot, because then it would automatically come to you. Oh, look how easy, you just fill it out, you just drop it, send it. What wasn't really talked through was the idea that the mom who is working 2 jobs, who means to mail it all the time, the grandparent where you got to pick it up, the truck driver,
feel bad.
Yeah, the truck driver, I knew, I was like, hey, I'm a Mexican mom, I will tell you. Like, no, the truck driver, literally, like, these are the people that you're talking about who keep meaning, oh yeah, oh yeah. And then finally on the last day, I do it for different purposes. I do it because it's my ticket into the polling place as a journalist to be able to see what's happening. So, but I also do it because I'm really busy and it's very hard to get. Like there are sometimes where I've like I've been in that position. I've seen people in that position. I've talked to people in that position. I have family members in that position. And so unless we change to disallow that, which I don't know if that's the direction we want, I do believe that's going to be more about the communication of, do you want your right taken away, Arizonans, where you cannot drop your ballot off on the day, or do you want to have to wait?
So Jane and I were together at a different meeting, and Jane recommended one more insert into the ballot packet explaining the process, why there's not 100% of results on an election night, further utilizing the text message system. So that's an instance in which we learned from Jane, because like I said, we'll try just about anything, but we're still learning and getting ideas, and that was a good one.
Jane, did you want to?
No, that what I was just going to say is, I think if we all, there's problems out there, and it's not a problem in the system, it's a problem in the understanding of what the system output is going to be. And so if we can just communicate with voters, you're not going to know who wins at 7:02 in a highly contested election in Arizona, and here's why, and it's not because of bad actors. So just taking those steps and learning and being iterative about how we approach these issues is so important.
I mean, I think
there's a problem of expectation.
Sure.
Set by, in part, this guy, because at 8:01, we would know that this guy won Arizona always because he would win by large margins. And right now, I was just like, you know, in election administration, we have a saying, high turnout, or excuse me, yeah, high turnout, high margins, high turnout, wide margins. And, you know, quite frankly, at this point, I just want the wide margins in Arizona, but I don't think we'll get them.
Yeah, and I don't know if our nation will get them for a while. We also had a law that passed that would ensure that the margin would require a recount. So we're having massive recounts, which then go back to feeding the delays, allowing more time for misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies to fill that gap. And so I think when we talk about truth, we have to really sit individually and think about the truth and what we're hearing from people, instead of throwing our hands up in the air and be like, I can't believe, like, how, okay, that is what someone thinks. They think that the pen is the reason. So at least they're talking and telling us, I think the pen. And so how can you create ways to have conversation to say, okay, if you think it's the pen, then how can we get you the right pen? Like, can we literally just put a box of like, this is the approved pens? You have to be able to hear the truth from people, because what happens too often is, and in journalism, this is the thing, we don't have the benefit of a wall. We know that distrust of journalists is at a historic high, journalism, media. And that is across the board. That's whether you're progressive politically, whether you're conservative politically, it is at an all-time high across all of those. And so we do not have the luxury of having a wall. And so when I talk to people who are trying to say, well, how do we make a difference? And how do we talk to people? And how do we bring people to this, to a agreement that it's not pens that are going to like destroy our election and that we should all riot, right? You do it by actually acknowledging and validating the fact that someone feels that it is a pen that is going to ruin their entire election and disenfranchise their vote, and therefore they should cause harm to elected officials, to their neighbor. You have to be able to talk to that person and hear their truth and have that be your starting point.
We are basically out of time, but I want each of you to, provide us your last remarks, last words. It's been great having each of you, your personal stories, really bringing it home. In that first panel, we talked about sort of policy and what we can tell the feds and the state officials and companies what they should be doing to try to help, defend democracy. I think we are hearing from each of you of how you're actually practically trying to move the needle in defending our democracy and improving it. So Jane, we'll start with you, then Diana, and Stephen will give you the last word.
So I remember sitting in an undergrad econ class and hearing about Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone and thinking, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then I've watched over time how this idea of social capital is a real issue in our world. We have to invest in the social capital of our nations, of our neighborhood, of everything that surrounds us. More in Common, which is a great organization, did a recent study about engaging across lines of difference. And they said, I don't know, 72% of Americans believe they have a duty to engage with people that are different than them, but only 4 in 10 Americans know how to do that, and mainly because they have a lack of opportunity. So how can we create opportunities for our children, for our communities to engage across lines of difference? How do we say when that relationship is hard, lean in and listen up instead of walk away? That is the work of community. And I truly believe in addition to the federal and state and private recommendations that the task force put forth, I think if we neglect our communities, we're missing one of the main frontline components that we can use to attack this plague.
Diana.
I think the reality is that there's an election that's going to happen. And there are results that are going to come in. And I think we need so many of these conversations, whether it be through civic journalism, public service journalism, civic-centered organizations like the very one that brought us together here. I think we need to look more past that election and how we're going to get together past that election as Americans, as communities, across states. And I'm hoping that when everybody leaves here today, that they think about that, because so much of the last few years has been a run up to this election and a conversation about this election. And I think if we start putting our brains together about post-election, we might find more commonality, and we might start imagining how to deal with the realities of how can we hear people so that people don't feel they need to harm someone. And that's truly post-election.
Spider-Man's uncle with his stepdad, Ben. Who's Ben? Uncle Ben. And George W. Bush both said, with great power comes great responsibility. And I was like, oh, that's just a movie line sort of thing, or I don't know the context of which George W. Bush was saying it, but there's a lot of truth to that. And I've learned that over the last 4 years. And the 1% of this country drives the conversation of 99%. And so, if you ever feel helpless, I would say don't. Everyone who's in this room probably has time, access, ability that vast majority of Americans don't have. And what you say does have a ripple effect. Now, the flip of that is true. If you say incendiary stuff, if you say the other side will make off with your children in the night, then there will be someone listening who will get animated by that, leave a violent voice message by that, or show up on a golf course with an AR-15 and think it's appropriate to try and assassinate a former president. So leaders matter, words matter, and even if you're not like, well, leadership's not really for me, then hold your leaders accountable. And when they post stupid videos, like the video of Paul Gosar, our Arizonan, like there was a video of like a ninja like chopping AOC's head or something like that. It's like, okay, we all get it in this room, and like it was supposed to be funny sort of thing and whatnot. But one of his constituents probably doesn't. And so it is, I guess, to use that same sword, it is a sword you wield as a leader, and please wield it wisely. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you. Diana, Jane, thank you for coming out from Arizona and sharing your stories and your experiences and how you're dealing with Miss Mal and all this other information, but really coming from a positive solution-oriented world. I think we can all learn from you, and hopefully others, whether it's online or otherwise, can learn from that. On behalf of the McCain Institute, Cronkite School, Christy, I'm going to just say thank you for everyone. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, we're trying to carry on the legacy of this guy and his family, to public service, country first. And I think all of you epitomize, the legacy of Senator McCain. So thank you again. Really appreciate your
Thank you,
time.
everybody.